Master Your Mindset Radio, episode number 9.
Welcome to Master Your Mindset Radio, the show where we empower you to conquer limiting beliefs and transform your world with your gifting and purpose. Now for your host, Elizabeth Nader.
Hey friends, welcome back. Today I am so excited to interview a friend and a colleague and somebody that I really look up to, George Khalaf. I have George Khalaf on with us today. Say hey, George.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth.
George is founder of Data Orbital and co-founder of the Resolute Group based out of Phoenix, Arizona. And he is somebody that has really made a name for himself at a young age and been able to create a unique company and a unique space that has gotten him a lot of attention and somebody that I think we should be watching. So I wanted him to talk to you guys today because I know how much he values mindset and mindset issues. So before we get into some of that, explain to everybody in ways that all of us can understand what it is that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I founded Data Orbital, which is a survey research and data visualization firm. And so survey research, that's the polling work that a lot of folks would see online or on TV, things like that. And then data visualization is anytime you see bars and charts and graphs and all that fun stuff, we build those for our clients. And we mostly do that for corporate clients, nonprofit clients, association clients, but in the policy and political space. So a lot of what I do is political. And that I founded back in 2013 and went full-time with that, which I'll tell that story a little bit later, in December of 2015. And then recently, at the beginning of this year, I co-founded with a business partner of mine, the Resolute Group, which does message and political consulting. And that one is very specifically and exclusively political.
So you're only 28 years old, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Did you imagine when you were 18 that you would be the owner of and co-founder of 2 companies by the time you were 28?
Absolutely not. I obviously always had big dreams. I always wanted to be in politics. That I could have for sure imagined. But a lot of my dreams I set out 20, 30 years down the line, especially in terms of owning businesses. I thought I'd be working for people for a long time. And so it was a complete shock. Even when I started the business, and quite frankly, 4 years into it today, 5 years into it, sometimes I'm still shocked that I'm an entrepreneur and I've started a couple businesses and started a couple and failed at them, but just done a lot more in the business space than I would have expected.
You've packed a lot into a short period of time already. And I think that I want to keep saying you're 28 because what really amazes me is that you are actually a millennial, right? I mean, you're validly in that generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Almost in the middle of it. Yeah.
So your peers are millennials, and those of us, I'm a little bit older than you, and those of us who are not in that generation, we tend to, maybe not in the fairest way, but we tend to identify pretty negative traits with millennials. We have a tendency to spread the idea that they aren't really on target in their lives, or that they're not willing to work hard, or that they don't have vision, or they're not sort of grasping for the golden ring. There's a lot that's said about millennials. So how do you feel being part of that generation and being so different from the ideas about millennials that are out there, and in fact paving the way in ways that you're not expected to, frankly, and many of your peers are not doing?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with something positive, and then I'll go into a couple of, I think, legitimate criticism. I think, obviously, being a millennial, as you said, we often get a bad rap. But I think there is a very positive difference, and there's actually a lot of articles written about it in terms of the behavior that millennials even do in terms of charitable giving than their parents and a lot of different things, and that millennials are very cause-driven. So most millennials are only going to get into a business if there's a cause. And so they're not getting into it just for money, or for example, from charitable giving, they're not just giving away money just to give it away. It has to feel like it's a cause that aligns with them. And that definitely resonates with me. The whole reason why I got into politics is I felt called into it. I feel like this is my mission field, like how some people's mission field is to go build homes, or some people's mission field is to do art. My mission field is politics, as odd as that may sound. And so that I really resonates with other millennials. I think there are a couple of very legitimate criticisms, though, and I'll focus on one that millennials have, is there's I think a lack of risk-taking amongst millennials because there's a high level of sensitivity. And I don't want to go into some places where people criticize millennials on sensitivity, so I'm going to talk about it relative to business, and that is relative to risk. In order to be a business owner, in order to be able I think to be successful in this world, you have to be willing to take risks. Look, it's smart risks, but they're risks nonetheless. And I think when there's a heightened level of sensitivity or a heightened level of, I'll call it entitlement, which I definitely as well think is a legitimate criticism for the generation, that then tends to lead people into saying things like what you said, which is millennials don't work hard and millennials don't do X, Y, and Z. And so while I think we're very cause driven, and I think a lot of us, our hearts are in the right place, but because there's this lack of risk stemming from this, I think, heightened level of sensitivity, I do think that leads into a sense of entitlement that I know my parents didn't have, and that's why I don't have it. Is because I grew up listening to stories of what my father particularly had to do back in the day in Lebanon, where we're from, and I definitely know that my grandparents' generation didn't have that, and so that's a stark difference between other generations and the millennial generation, I think.
Okay, so the word entitlement, I think, is key to what gets how that generation gets labeled, but it's really a mindset, right? I mean, what I talk about in everything I do is focus on mindset. You have been raised a certain way, but you're also surrounded by this mentality of the participation trophy generation. And in order to combat that, you have the advantage of your parents and how they raised you, but you have the disadvantage of what society is telling you, what your peers are telling you. So what mindset do you have to succeed in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, look, when I was, I'm not that good at sports. Anyone that knows me will know that. And so my first year that I played baseball, I got the Rookie of the Year award. Well, guess what? I was the only rookie at the team, but they had to give me some sort of award. I got 2 hits all season, which is not good in any way, shape, or form. And so, as you said, you couple that, though, with growing up, my father started working from the age of 13 for various reasons, which I won't get into on the podcast, but had to do a lot in his life and had to overcome a lot, and it all stemmed from hard work. And so I grew up with that type of mentality in my ear, and so I know that when things get difficult, I have to persevere. It's not that something is difficult and so someone else is causing it to be difficult or someone else should solve my problems. I'm responsible for that solution. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not good at everything. I know I know that I don't know everything. And so I seek help from people that know more than me. And I have a lot of mentors, and I pride myself in that. That's something that I didn't learn extremely early on, but I've really picked up in the last 4 or 5 years, is that you surround yourself with smart people and you surround yourself with people that know more than you. And I think that's a marker of a good leader anyways. But you have to persevere when things get difficult. And I think the entitlement causes a lot in the generation to say, oh, something is difficult. Well, someone else is responsible for this. Someone else caused this problem for me. So I need to go out and do something to stop that person from causing this problem versus just working through it myself and persevering. And that's a major, major difference than people grew up in the Great Depression and then people that grew up in the 60s and the 70s. It just wasn't the mentality that they had.
It's a difference of responsibility. But what's interesting is that you've chosen a field primarily. I know you work for corporate clients and things, but primarily you've chosen to be in politics. Now, adding in sort of this entitlement mentality and all that we're seeing out there in the political arena, how are you surviving in that world when it's so divisive? How are you surviving in that world when you're choosing to sort of have a more, I want to use the word mature mindset on things and trying to actually apply your skills and abilities every day in a cause-driven way that isn't driving you crazy? I mean, I see the things on TV, I want to turn it off. I purposely have a tendency to want to avoid some of those conversations because they're so divisive. It's not what I grew up seeing. It's not, going into that field was something that was more admirable back in the day. Now someone choosing to be in politics, you're looking at that and you're saying, oh my gosh, I mean, you're choosing to fight tooth and nail all the time. You're choosing to be in divisive environments. You are in competitive environments, but people are going after the other side in ways that we've never seen before. How do you do that and actually love it? And how do you do that and keep a mindset that says, I was born to do this. This is my gift. This is my talent. I can actually change the world through all of this when all we're seeing on the news constantly is negativity?
Yeah, I mean, that is actually a question that I get asked, if not on a weekly basis, multiple times a month. And for me, it 100% starts in my faith and why I feel like I do what I do. I feel like my ability to be in politics and to persevere, if I start at the end, to kind of answer your question and work backwards, stems from the fact that I feel like this is my blessing and this is what I was meant to do. And so because I was meant to do it, you persevere, and that I feel like I was equipped by God to be able to have the skills that I need. Now, to work backwards from there, though, there are many, many difficult days. There are many low points. I mean, I had one, if I'm being honest, 2-3 weeks ago, where I stopped and thought. I was in the conference room by myself, pacing, which I often do when I'm on phone calls. And I just said, how much longer can I do this? While I'm only 28, I've been in the political world for almost 10 years. That's, I think I calculated the other day, I believe that's 8 election cycles. That is like an eternity going through 8 election cycles. And I don't mean presidential, of course. It's every 2 years, the 7 or 8 election cycles and election cycles in between. And so I'm like, how much longer can I do this? And then a couple weeks later, something will happen last week where I'll just have an absolute high point. I'm like, this is why I'm in this. This is why God put me in this field. But I'll tell you, when I was 13, I was the kid that would leave the other teenagers, and I'd go sit with the adults. In the Lebanese culture, politics is talked about often. I mean, when I say often, I mean anytime that more than 2 Lebanese people or more than one Lebanese person is together, you're talking about politics. Mm-hmm. And so I would talk with them, and I was just enamored by it. I didn't quite understand it, but I was enamored about learning about it and surrounding myself with people that discussed politics. And so today, from a mindset perspective, to kind of link it back to that, it is very difficult because you are trying to be torn down day in and day out. But at the beginning of this year, we put a motto up on the wall, and it was fearlessness through faith, that we need to be fearless, but because of our faith. Now, obviously, not everyone that works at our firm is Christian, and it's not about everyone having, necessitatingly, being a Christian. But for me, that's where it comes from, is that I know that I am fearless and that I need to drive out fear, which, again, I'll tell you is my number one, to use a line from your book, my number one limiting belief is fear. I can talk about that a little bit later. But I know I need to be fearless through my faith. And that will be the only way that I can persevere. Because if it's up to me, my low points are probably going to dominate my high points. And I can't allow them to, because I think it's too important what I do. And I do love what I do. And I think while a lot of people don't like politics, I just want to remind the listeners that politics affects everyone's life on a daily basis. Just because we're pretending it doesn't exist, that doesn't mean it's not happening around us, and that doesn't mean it affects things like your taxes and honestly everything in between. And so politics is important, and it's too important for me to walk away from. And so I have to continue to be fearless.
I love that you say that, because it is something we tend to avoid areas of pain in our life. And we do it because we don't want to do the work to deal with it. We want to be in denial and say it doesn't matter. And just on a broader scale, I think people are checking out more and more of the political process, checking out of it, not wanting to engage in it because of the vitriol. Either you're going to be extreme in it or you're just checked out. And it's really not the right solution, because it does affect our daily lives. But not everyone is built to want to be in that kind of environment all the time, and the constant churning of emotions. And I think we're manipulated by the media a lot in that area to be churning the emotions and constantly upset and looking at someone who believes a little differently than you as an enemy. And it seems like there's no middle ground anymore. So you're in that industry, and I know you kind of have an old soul in all of that, and maybe that gives you the ability to deal with it, but you're choosing not only to stay in it, but aren't you choosing to pursue it in a bigger way? Tell us about your future plans and hopes.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I want to lead by example. That doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination I'm perfect. There's going to be a lot of people that disagree with political opinions that I take, or clients that I take on, or causes that I choose to support or oppose. But I always strive to do so from a place of honor, from a place of respect, so that no one can doubt my intentions for why I do what I do. My beliefs are very clear. If you go to the Resolute group, resolute.group, our website, you can see, the value systems that we hold. We're not hiding anything, but we're doing it from a place of love, not to overuse that word. I think it's a word that unfortunately is overused a lot, but we sincerely mean it. I believe what I believe, but that doesn't mean I need to do so negatively. And actually, one of my biggest sort of mentors and people, I'll tell you, and I'll answer the question about where I hope to be from a goals perspective. But one of the people I look up to a lot is Dr. Arthur Brooks, who's an economist. He's the former president of the American Enterprise Institute. And he has a new book that he recently put out called Love Your Enemies. And some people may still disagree with some components of the book, but it's the idea that you can't love what you don't know, and that we need to start knowing people that disagree with us so that we can be able to love them. Because the whole point of the political world is we're trying to achieve results for America, for whatever state that we live in, Arizona, New Jersey, what have you. But we can't do so if we all question the other people's intentions, the other person's intentions. And I agree with you. I think it is stoked by the media, which again is a conversation for another day. But I look to lead by example. And so to kind of tie that into where I hope to be, and again, to bring up, limiting fear. When I was younger, someone would ask me what my goals are. I would be very timid about them and shy, because why should a 21, 22-year-old from a nothing family, proud of my parents, but we didn't come from, any special family. We don't have some special money, special connections. Why should I think I aspire to be in Congress or aspire to do whatever it may be? And so I limited myself in that because I was afraid or shy or, whatever it may be. And that's been, again, the big focus of this year for me is being fearless through faith. And so, now I can proudly say that, yeah, I do think I'd like to run for office one day, probably at the federal level. We'll see how things unfold. Obviously, the political world is very tumultuous and changes by the year, by the second, by the month. And so, but I do think I'd like to be in elective office. My real pie in the sky goal is I'd love to be the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon, to be able to serve my country today, the United States of America, absolutely proud to be a United States citizen, but to also be able to serve and help the country where I'm from and where I was born, which is Lebanon. And so, look, someone may hear me and say, "Oh, George, you want to be ambassador?" I get it. It's not going to be easy, but you know what? I've never. It's not a goal if it's going to be right in front of you. It's going to be easy, right?
That's
goal
right.
Meant to be. You can climb at something that I know you talk about often, Elizabeth. And so it is a big goal, and I'm proud of it. And now I'm proud to say it. I would never have said something like this publicly to a bunch of people that I've never met that are going to listen to your podcast. But I'm proud to say it. I would love to be the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon.
I love that. I love that you just said that. So we're going out there with that now. It's on record. And when in my book, when I say write out your introduction 10 years from now, I hope you've done that. We'll talk about the book at the end, but I hope you've done that, and that you say in there you're being introduced as Mr. Ambassador. Doing that requires stepping out of the fear that says people will judge me, stepping out and away from the fear that says, who am I and how dare I say that? Because those are the voices that want to keep us small. And even from telling ourselves that, much less telling other people and writing that down and reading it out loud, or in some way, giving it to people that will hold us accountable to it. So I hope if you haven't done that exercise, I hope that you do that. And when you get closer to that goal, you keep pushing the goal line out further.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to tell a quick story about this fear thing because it's a defining story. My father brought it up to me all the time because I'd kind of forgotten it. It happened when I was fairly young. I used to play chess. And I was decent at chess, actually, in hindsight. In my age category, I was ranked pretty well in the chess world. And I loved it. I loved to play chess. But anytime I'd have a chess match and I'd walk up to the table, and for anyone that knows chess, there's two types of chess that you can play. You play chess just sort of regular, and then you play chess with a speed clock. And it's called, some sort of speed chess, but you're timing each other's moves. Anytime I saw someone with a clock, I literally and instantly started to cry. This is not an exaggeration. And I'd run to my father and I'd say, I'm going to lose. Mm-hmm. And he'd ask me why. And I would logically tell him, well, if they have a clock, that means they have to be good at chess. Their parents would not have otherwise invested. This is me, by the way, saying this at 9 or 10 years old. Their parents would not have invested in a clock. And so for them to have a clock, that means they have to be good. And how can I beat them? That was my mentality as a little kid. And if I'm being honest, that fear of being defeated, even though now something I'm proud of is to say I'm not afraid of failure, which I know is one of sort of the largest portions of your book, the last chapter that you wrote first, and which is a absolutely critical chapter. But that fear is carried on throughout the mass majority of my life. And while I'm proud of so many of my accomplishments, and if someone from the outside would look at me and say, George, you've done all these things, but man, I was always and will always continue to be my own worst critic. And I think that's part of continuing to hold my feet to the fire and wanting myself to get better and better. But that fear is such a big part, was such a big part of what defined me. But I absolutely have to conquer it. And it really was, reading your book, chatting with you, even obviously as a friend, and just as my life has progressed and talking with mentors, I absolutely pinpointed fear, and then things sprung from that, both in my personal and my professional life, that I think caused me to make some decisions that I would not have otherwise done had I done them from a place of faith versus a place of fear. And I'm not saying faith as in your religious faith. I'm saying like having faith in yourself and in the decision that you're going to make.
Right.
I made decisions out of fear.
Right. Faith versus fear. I mean, the two are polar opposites. They can't live in the same space. You're either in one or you're in the other. And they're not things that coexist together. But I think the idea that we ever eliminate it fully from our lives, you would agree, I'm sure, is false.
Yes.
It's often a motivator, and in some cases it's not bad in that regard. But I think the worst part of fear is that acronym, false evidence appearing real, because it's that almost brainwashing where we see, like you said, with the kids with the clocks, you've somehow you associated that with the fact that they must be better than you. And it's
Yes.
amazing as a little kid, but think about how profound that is, that you just decided that that's it, that you're not as good because they had that. And we do that as children, but we do it as adults all the time. We make these snap judgments and decisions, that false evidence appearing real. And from that, we behave, and our mindset is created, and none of it was based in the truth. None of it was based in reality. And then that becomes our paradigm, and we live in that for so long that it takes a while for us to realize and recognize that we've been living by falsehood. Frankly, we've been living driven by fears that weren't even based in any truth. I mean, if I'm afraid of something real, like burning my hand on a stove, that's a motivating fear. That's a real thing. But if I'm afraid of something I've made up in my mind, of, some that people will judge me if I do X, Y, or Z, or if I'm successful that I'll lose it all, or whatever that is, it's a limiting belief that literally paralyzes. So fear will never go away. I believe that. But if we look at it correctly, we know how to deal with it, we can turn it into something that's motivating. I
So
love the quote, by the way, I have to say before I forget it, and say again who that's from, that we can't love what we don't know. Did I say that right?
yeah, you don't love what you don't know is a quote from Aquinas, I believe, but that's the basis of Dr. Arthur Brooks's book, Love Your Enemies. And I really highly encourage your listeners to, if not read that book, but think about that concept and follow some of the work that Dr. Brooks is doing. He's someone that's lived in the political world. He's not a politician. He's an economist by trade, the president of a think tank, and now is a professor at Harvard. But he's now, his whole life's sort of mission and work is going to be around this: is why have we gotten to where we've gotten? Why is it so divisive? And his conclusion, or his sort of hypothesis, is because we're trying to love our enemies because we're viewing the other side as enemies. And I think we need to just get to know who the other side is, because the other side, to be honest with you, it could change. Obviously, being on the inside, the belly of the beast in the political world, I know that is relative. I mean, who's your opponent and who's your friend could change by the hour. And so you need to have a sense that, yes, I am very convicted about my beliefs, and I will, I'm not going to compromise my core beliefs. But you have to be able to be willing to work with people that disagree with you. I've always prided myself in that, and I think we're losing that desire. To be honest with you, is to this desire to be willing and able and excited to work with those that we disagree with.
I agree with you, and I want to take his quote in a different direction, because it hit me in this regard. A lot of times we deal a lot with self-hatred, and a lot of people don't love themselves. And you know why they don't love themselves is they don't know themselves. We are not taught to look at ourselves and say, what are my gifts? How do I develop my talents for my gifts? What did God create me to do? What is unique about me? Because that's something that we shy away from. Most people do. And I find that most people I work with don't have the self-love. And they don't have the self-love because they don't know themselves. And they don't know why they're here. And they don't have a sense of purpose. And they don't have a sense of destiny. So if you don't know yourself, it's really hard to love yourself. And if you can't love yourself, it's really hard to believe that you have purpose. It's really hard to believe that you're here to make a difference, and therefore why try? And therefore why fight limiting beliefs? Why even think about it? And so it really begins with know thyself, right? It really begins with understanding the uniqueness. I always say that you were created for a purpose, on purpose, or switch that around. You were created on purpose for a purpose. Either way, it works. But that's one thing that I constantly see in people, and they have this really this lack of understanding of why they're here. And without that, we're not driven to achieve. Without that, we're not driven to make change. And then now we're dealing with the heights of anxiety, especially in your generation. We really are. And the generation following. We're dealing with the heights of self-doubt. We're dealing with higher suicide rates. We're dealing with all of this lack of self-love because it's rooted in not understanding yourself.
Absolutely.
So somehow you figured out a lot. I mean, I know you've got a lot to figure out. We all do, right? But somehow in your 20s, you got to a point where you said, I understand who I am to the degree that I'm willing to step out and take these risks. And did that come from your parents? Did that come from hard work? Is it just something inside of you that said, looked in the mirror and you said, I believe in this person and I get why I'm here. I get why God created me.
I mean, I've absolutely, I've absolutely been blessed from a young age to know that I like politics. So it started from there. But that doesn't necessarily, people like all kinds of things at a young age, and maybe that doesn't end up translating into their career. But that was my step one. Step two is my parents, from a culture that did not necessarily in any way encourage people to get into politics. They knew how much I loved it. And my father said, I will encourage you and I will support you in doing whatever you need to do, even if I have to pay your way because you're going to take a free internship, but do something that's in your passion. Live your passion out. My father, both my parents, highly encouraged me to live my passions out. So that was the next step. Then the third step was I surrounded myself with people, and I had the drive and the motivation. I will say it is hard work, to answer that part of your question, to then go seek out people in a community of people that I knew would help me better achieve my goals, or at least were kind of in this world. So I wasn't idly by saying I like politics and then my parents telling me to live it out, and then I was sitting on my hands wishing it and willing it to come to me. I was making things happen. And so in high school, when the elections were happening, I was engaging with my classmates. That wasn't formal political work. It's not like I had an internship, but I was actively engaged. Then when I went to college, for my first semester, even though my counselors said, you should be very careful what you do your first semester, focus on class. I said, class is great. I'm going to get good grades, but I know I want to do this. I got an internship my first semester and I had an internship or work in my field every semester until I graduated. And I graduated college in the heights of the Great Depression, not the Great Depression, sorry, the Great Recession, I should say. And I had a job before I graduated. I did the last semester online. And I actually, because I was asked by my employer to move to Washington, D.C., the capital of the political world, before I even graduated. And I had to fly back for my graduation. How many people in my graduating class could say that? Now, look, I was absolutely blessed, but I worked hard for that. I busted my tail for that. I put myself in the right place. I worked long hours and overnights, and I did the menial work, which some people aren't willing to do, because I knew that work, when it grew upon itself and I did it well and worked harder and harder, and it would open more and more doors, and it got me to where I was then and then where I am today. And so I think it's a combination of a lot of what you said, but it starts layer by layer. But I do want to touch on one thing that kind of relates to the first part of what you said and then what we were talking about earlier. It's that idea of community. I do think there's a lot of people that don't get to where they are because they may have limiting beliefs, but they don't have a community of people like the community that I think you're building. And I think it's amazing that you're building it to encourage them along the way, because not everyone has it in them to be motivated and to be, to be able to work through all this. But if they had a community around them, they'd be able to persevere and move through. And I don't think a lot of people have that. And I think that's a lot of what plagues my generation, quite frankly, is that for whatever reason, the community around them does not encourage them to do that. So I just want to touch on that point and sort of emphasize it, because I've been blessed also with a great community that I've built and interjected myself into. It did not just come to me, but I think that's critical.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that has to do also with our further isolation via technology and social media, in that we don't seek out community, or we don't find community in a genuine way. So you've got two little boys, and
I do.
And they're great little guys. They're young. They're 2 and 4?
Yes.
Okay. So you have obviously a chance now to invest in them in a way that your parents did, and even in a greater way because of what you've learned. So what do you plan to do? What do you plan to say to them? How do you plan to guide them so that they can find their purpose, so they can be encouraged, so they grow up with less limiting beliefs than you did?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you, there's no greater mentor on my life, and he knows this, and I have the absolute honor of working with my father every day now. And not many people get that honor in their lives to work with their fathers. But my father modeled many of the things that I'm talking to you about in a generation that experienced catastrophe in the Lebanese Civil War, and he had to start his life over multiple times. both because of financial problems and crises because of the Great Recession, and obviously after the Civil War and coming to a new country with my mother and starting over. And that role model, I always tell him that if I'm able to be that type of role model for my children, my two boys, and that dynamic, of course, that sons have with their fathers, I want to be able to role model hard work for them. I want them to be able to see that nothing in life is handed to them. I want them to be surrounded by a community of people that, of course, I put into their lives that encourage them and build them up, not tear them down. So many of our children today, I'm talking about our little kids, and then people in my age category are torn down by people older than them. And it's an absolute crisis, and it's an absolute calamity. And we need to encourage them and build them up. But I also want my kids to know that, look, you may fail sometimes. You're not going to get first place every time. You're not going to medal in something. It's okay if you come home from a chess tournament, if they play chess or if they play soccer or whatever it may be. And you know what? Today you're the one that lost. What did we learn from that? Now, we could still encourage them and say, you're going to do good and all that. And of course, if you're 4, it's a different conversation than if you're 14. But I don't want to tell them that, it's going to all be okay and dad's going to always, it's not about that. No, they're going to have to fail on their own and of course, being surrounded by people and pick themselves back up and move forward. And so I absolutely want to model that, though. And I cannot underscore enough that idea and that mentality about having a role model to look up to, having mentors. That's huge. And I didn't learn that by accident. My father actively did that for me, and I want to actively do that for my 2 sons. And of course, fathers do that for their daughters and mothers do that for their sons and daughters. Don't get me wrong, but obviously because I've got 2 little boys and I know what my father, the type of role model he was for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. I agree with you. We've lost the concept of mentors. Obviously, we have a big loss of father figures, but looking beyond even the father being at home, I think we've lost that concept of mentors. So let's just adjust quickly to the book, because I know you value mindset. I think that's one thing that you and I love to talk about, all of that. And I so appreciate the fact that you were an early reader before the book was published, and I got great feedback from you. So, I mean, it's a long book, but tell me, just pick out a few things that really impacted you, because I know how you are. I know it, you reading it, you're thinking about how it applies to your personal life, your business life, your goals. So just give the listeners a few top things from the book that you think were impactful.
Absolutely. And of course, it goes without saying, for anyone that's listening to this podcast, they obviously already get the value of what you provide and what this idea of shifting mindset provides, but I cannot recommend the book enough. I mean, I was beyond ecstatic, and I believe, if I remember correctly, I read it in 48 hours. The book, I think it's a little bit more than 200 pages, but that's how excited I was about it. And so the 2 things that I want to talk about, and of course we've talked about parts of them throughout because you can, of course, tell how impactful they are, is the idea of limiting beliefs. I had never thought about them, that phrase limiting beliefs. I'd never used it before. I didn't know what that meant. I just knew that there were things that held me back. I didn't understand it in the way that the book really set out, and then helping me to actually articulate what my limiting belief was, right? Fear, amongst other things. My brain didn't work in that fashion. I knew what I needed to do better, but I didn't understand what it was to have a limiting belief and how I could conquer it, and how, especially the photo that you have in the book of the "Hi, my name is," or "Hello, my name is." I mean, that was huge, because we make fun of those name tags a lot of times, and who wants to put that on their chest, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But that idea of how do you want the world to know you, I think that's absolutely huge. And you don't want the world to know you by your limiting beliefs, and your limiting beliefs stop you from really introducing yourself to the world. And so that part of the book was absolutely critical for me. It was very important. And then the last chapter, which you started first, and that was the first thing that, of course, you wrote in that last chapter, which is the chapter about failure. Look, everyone has failures. I've had failures in my life. I have a software company that I tried to get spun up, and it just didn't work for one reason or another. Look, it was an expensive failure, but it was a failure nonetheless. I learned about how to manage software projects. I learned about how what it meant to bring something to market or not bring something to market. I learned the ins and outs of all of it, and I learned something from it. If I looked at that failure and I just saw it, and I used it to, well, George, yep, you failed again. What are you going to do now? And then it kind of held me back. No, I used that failure to double down and to persevere and say, okay, that failure, how do I resolve it? How do I learn from it? How do I move forward? But we are 100% afraid of failure.
Yes.
We run away from failure. When we fail, it's debilitating. And I cannot tell you, and it sincerely breaks my heart. I don't say this lightly. It really does. It's given me chills even sort of saying this. I know so many people because of their fear of failure, they literally will not attempt to even execute on amazing ideas and, quite frankly, deprive the world of their talents and their treasures and the blessing that God gave them because they're afraid to fail.
Yeah.
And I would just encourage all those that have that fear. And again, it's just huge part of the book, that chapter on failure. Anyone that's afraid of failure, to push through and to look at, which you have many stories, short stories about people, very prominent people, of course, and everyone will know: Abraham Lincoln, Muhammad Ali, you name it. A lot of people, Rocky, a lot of people have failed and have then gone on to do amazing things. And it's just huge to realize that you're not in it alone. Everyone fears failure. Most people fear failure.
Yes.
Most people have failed. And that, to me, is one of the most amazing things too, and critical things, is to realize that I'm not in this alone. There's other people that feel the same things that I feel. Sometimes, for whatever reason, as human beings, we isolate ourselves as if we're the only ones that feel these emotions. And of course, we know that that's not true.
Right.
Our brain tricks us into that. And it's just critical to read 200 plus pages from you and from someone who has gone through their fair share of failures, which you dictate and willing to, quite frankly, share those stories, is huge. Mm-hmm. And then you lay them out for people. It makes you relatable. It brings it close to home, and it says, well, if she can do it, I can do it too. And it just cannot underscore how important that is for human beings.
I love that. And it's no small thing that I wrote that chapter first, and then it ends up being the last chapter. And I think when you do something like write a book and you pour your heart into it, sometimes you see things later from a distance. And I think the reality is that we have to first understand what mindset's all about. We understand what a limiting belief is, like you said. We start to figure out how to change that limiting belief. And then in the book, you move into then purpose, because you can't get to your purpose. If God has for you to be ambassador to Lebanon, you're not going to get there if you don't clean up limiting beliefs. And it's, of course, a daily practice we do the rest of our lives. But the reason failure comes in there at the end is because we do all that work. We focus, we're moving forward, we're really excited, and then we fail at something. It's inevitable, right? And that's where, I think you said it so well, where people fall down. And if they don't get back up, it's a lost destiny. If they don't get back up, it's a lost life from the standpoint of what they had to contribute and how they were to change the world in their own way, which is so critical, however that way is. And so failure becomes fabric of your story, and it's necessary, and people try to avoid it, but in doing so they avoid purpose, and that is the danger of avoiding failure. It's not like any of us are going to sit here and say we love it. You don't want to fail, I don't want to fail, I'm not excited about it, but it's necessary. And when we look at it with a different mindset, then the fear disappears. And when the fear disappears, we boldly go into it. So that's, I think now looking back, it was the perfect both beginning and ending to the book in that regard, because it's the last thing I need people to stay with. When you try to do your best work, as you move forward in these next few years and you reach towards your goals, you're going to have that resistance, and that resistance is going to try to get you to stop. So that's why failure is something necessary, because it shows you that you're on purpose, but also we have to be able to overcome it. So listen, I've taken up a lot of your time. This is awesome. I want everyone to know who's listening to remember George's name. George Khalaf. You got to remember his name, because I guarantee you that he will be doing something on a broader scale. You'll know him either in Congress or perhaps something within international diplomacy. I don't take lightly what his goals are, because I see the possibility in him. So be excited that you heard this now, and someday you'll say, I remember that guy. I really believe that, George. So
Thank you.
I really
appreciate
I appreciate you taking your time. And guys, I want to remind you that the book is on Amazon, Master Your Mindset, The Master's Way. So if you haven't had a chance yet, go get it. And definitely check out everything on social media, on Facebook, be part of the community. If you go to my website at elizabethnader.com, you'll find all that information. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. We're coming out every week on Tuesday mornings with something fresh, something new, fun interviews like this that will get you inspired about your own particular goals and purpose, and just ideas to help you make it better through the week. So guys, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to Master Your Mindset Radio. Before you go, if you want to be part of a free online community of like-minded individuals for support, resources, and inspiration as you conquer your limiting beliefs and pursue your purpose, go to elizabethnader.com/community. That's elizabethnader.com/community, or search for Master Your Mindset Academy private group on Facebook. Looking forward to seeing you online.